One insult was all it took. One moment where restraint finally cracked, and Washington stopped murmuring behind closed doors and began shouting in full view. This was not a policy address wrapped in applause lines, and it was not a campaign rally engineered for easy clips. It was raw, emotional, and unmistakably personal. The kind of outburst that makes aides freeze and commentators reach for words like unprecedented. When J.D. Vance, he did not reach for the careful language expected of his office, and he did not pause to sand down the edges. He chose fury, and in doing so he forced the country to confront a question it has spent years trying to avoid. The line itself spread faster than the context that produced it, as viral moments usually do. Clips were shared, clipped again, reframed, and reposted with captions that said more about the poster than the event. To supporters, it sounded like a man finally refusing to tolerate cruelty disguised as politics. To critics, it sounded like a senior official abandoning the discipline his position demands. Somewhere between those two reactions sat a deeper discomfort that no hashtag could quite capture. Because once a vice president publicly loses patience, the issue is no longer just tone, it is precedent. What made this moment combustible was not that anger existed, but that it had a target beyond policy. The attacks Vance referenced were not about votes, ideology, or legislative strategy. They were about his wife, her background, her identity, and her legitimacy in the public imagination. American politics has a long tradition of pretending families are off-limits while quietly rewarding anyone willing to ignore that rule. In this case, the pretense finally collapsed, and everyone noticed. For years, politicians have been told to absorb abuse with a smile and call it leadership. The unspoken rule is simple. If you run for office, you surrender not just your privacy, but your dignity. Family members are expected to remain silent, absorb the fallout, and trust that the system will eventually move on. Vance did not follow that script, and that refusal alone would have guaranteed controversy. The profanity only ensured that the argument would not fade quietly. In Washington, tone is not a side issue. It is currency. How something is said often matters more than what is said, especially when the speaker occupies a high office. A vice president is not merely an individual with feelings, but a symbol of institutional restraint. When that symbol cracks, critics immediately worry about what comes next. If this line can be crossed once, what other lines suddenly look optional? That anxiety is where Adam Schiff enters the picture. Schiff did not rush to defend the attacks on Vance's family, and he did not minimize their ugliness. Instead, he shifted the focus to the role Vance was playing when he responded. His argument was not emotional, and that was intentional. He framed the issue as one of responsibility, not provocation. Schiff's concern was not that Vance felt angry, but that he expressed that anger from a position of enormous authority. In Schiff's telling, leadership is defined less by what one feels and more by what one restrains. A vice president's words do not exist in a vacuum. They echo downward through the political ecosystem. When those words normalize escalation, others are encouraged to escalate further. There is an irony here that Schiff understands well. American politics routinely rewards performative outrage while publicly condemning it. Politicians who shout are criticized, but also amplified. Calm warnings are praised, but often ignored. Schiff's response risked being drowned out precisely because it was measured. Yet that restraint was the point he was trying to defend. The clash between these two men is not really about profanity or decorum alone. It is about competing visions of leadership in a media environment that thrives on conflict. Vance's defenders argue that authenticity matters more than etiquette. that voters are tired of rehearsed outrage and sanitized responses. Schiff's camp argues that authenticity without limits is not courage, it is abdication. The disagreement is philosophical, not merely partisan. At the center of it all sits a question that refuses to stay quiet. When does defending one's family stop being a moral necessity and start becoming a political weapon? Is there a way to draw that line without empowering those who exploit it? And perhaps most uncomfortably, who benefits when that line disappears entirely? American politics has always claimed that families should be left alone, yet history tells a different story. Spouses become symbols, children become collateral, and private lives are repackaged as public narratives. The outrage only flares when someone refuses to accept that arrangement. Vance's outburst shattered the illusion that everyone still agrees on the rules. Schiff's response attempted to restore them, or at least remind the country why they once mattered. This first collision set the tone for everything that followed. It was not a misunderstanding to be clarified later, or a slip of the tongue to be walked back quietly. It was a declaration, answered not with counter-insults, but with a warning about consequences. The question now hanging over Washington is not who was right in that moment. It is whether the system still knows how to handle moments like this at all. If Part 1 exposed the rupture, Part 2 lives inside the argument that followed, where the noise cooled just enough for the lines to harden. This was the phase where cable panels stopped asking what happened and started asking what it meant. The debate narrowed, sharpened, and then split cleanly in two directions. On one side stood those who insisted that human reaction was not a flaw, but a correction. On the other stood those who believed that power exists precisely to restrain reaction. At the center of that second camp was Adam Schiff, who approached the controversy with the demeanor of someone less interested in winning the moment than preserving the frame. Schiff did not raise his voice or compete for viral phrasing. He spoke slowly, almost stubbornly, as if daring the media ecosystem to keep up. In doing so, he made a deliberate choice to look boring in an age that punishes boredom. That choice itself became part of the argument. Schiff's position rested on a premise that sounds simple until it is tested under pressure. Holding office, he argued, is not merely about representing voters, but about modeling limits. Those limits are not decorative traditions. They are structural supports. Remove them one by one, and the entire system begins to sag under the weight of personal grievance. Schiff was not accusing anyone of malice. He was accusing the moment of temptation. The temptation, in his view, was to confuse justification with permission. Yes, attacks on family members are wrong, corrosive, and increasingly common. Yes, anger in response to that cruelty is human and understandable. But when a vice president responds publicly with unfiltered rage, Schiff warned, the response risks validating the very culture it condemns. The system learns what it rewards by watching who gets amplified. This is where the clash with J.D. Vance became less about words and more about theory. Vance's defenders framed his reaction as overdue honesty, a rejection of elite etiquette that protects abusers more than victims. Schiff reframed it as institutional erosion dressed up as authenticity. One side saw courage in refusal. The other saw danger in precedent. Neither side accused the other of bad faith, but neither backed down. Schiff returned repeatedly to the idea of signal versus intent. Intent, he conceded, may have been protective and sincere. Signal, however, travels farther and lasts longer. When a senior official signals that personal offense justifies public escalation, Others receive permission without inheriting the same sense of responsibility. The ladder of authority works downward, not upward. There was also a subtle edge to Schiff's critique that rarely made it into headlines. He questioned not just the outburst itself, but the political incentive structure surrounding it. Outrage, he implied, is no longer a risk in American politics. It is a resource. The louder the reaction, the greater the attention. In that environment, restraint begins to look less like virtue and more like malpractice. That observation carried a quiet irony. Schiff himself has often been criticized as overly careful, overly legalistic, too slow for a culture that wants instant judgment. In this moment, those same traits positioned him as the institutional counterweight. He was not competing with Vance's anger. He was attempting to quarantine it. Whether that quarantine could hold was another matter entirely. The humor in Schiff's response surfaced only indirectly, in the form of dry understatement. He did not mock Vance personally, but he did mock the idea that raw expression equals moral clarity. At one point, he suggested that if every elected official responded to provocation with personal fury, Congress would need padded walls instead of microphones. The line landed softly, but it landed. It was the kind of joke that signals disapproval without inviting retaliation. Still, Schiff knew humor alone could not carry the argument. He returned again and again to the concept of duty. Duty to office, duty to precedent, duty to the people watching who learn how politics works by example. His concern was not limited to this incident, but to the next one, and the one after that. Once escalation becomes normal, de-escalation looks like weakness. This framing exposed the real fault line beneath the controversy. Is leadership defined by emotional alignment with public anger, or by the ability to absorb it without amplification? Is restraint a sign of distance from ordinary experience, or a service rendered precisely because power magnifies consequences? Schiff insisted that the second definition still mattered, even if it no longer went viral. Critics of Schiff dismissed his argument as outdated, a relic of a political era that no longer exists. They argued that calls for restraint ring hollow when cruelty spreads unchecked online. Schiff did not deny that reality, but he refused to surrender to it. If the rules have collapsed, he implied, the answer is not to celebrate the collapse, but to rebuild. Part 2 of this story, then, is not about who won the exchange. It is about whether the country still recognizes the language Schiff is speaking. His argument assumes that norms are fragile but recoverable, that leadership still carries an obligation to rise above provocation. Vance's argument assumes that norms already failed, and honesty now requires confrontation. The audience is left to decide which assumption feels closer to the truth. As the debate moved forward, one thing became clear. This was no longer a momentary controversy fueled by a single clip. It had evolved into a referendum on how American politics processes anger itself. And in that referendum, Adam Schiff positioned himself not as a moral judge, but as a warning sign planted just far enough ahead to be ignored at our own risk. By the time the argument reached its third phase, the tone had shifted again, away from immediate reaction and towards something more unsettled. This was no longer just a dispute about what a vice president said or how a senator responded. It had become a broader unease about where American politics now draws its emotional boundaries. The noise softened, but the questions sharpened, and those questions refused to stay politely abstract. What happens when anger becomes the most reliable form of credibility? When outrage is no longer a liability, but a credential that proves someone is authentic enough for the moment? Supporters of J.D. Vance leaned into that logic without apology. They argued that years of restraint produced nothing but escalating abuse, and that silence had been mistaken for permission. In that framing, Vance's reaction was not reckless, but corrective, a message that some lines still matter. Yet Adam Schiff saw a different danger lurking behind the applause. He worried less about this particular outburst and more about what it normalized. If anger is the currency that buys attention, then the incentive is always to escalate. Today, it is a vice president defending his wife. Tomorrow, it is a senator defending his ego. The day after that, it is someone with far less restraint and far fewer consequences. This is where the questions grew more uncomfortable and more pointed. Does free speech truly mean freedom from consequence when exercised from the highest offices? Or does power itself impose a different kind of responsibility, one that limits expression precisely because it carries weight? If every provocation justifies escalation, who decides when escalation ends? And if no one does, what exactly are institutions for? There is also an awkward truth that no side likes to say out loud. American politics has trained its audience to reward emotional extremes. Calm explanations struggle to compete with clips that pulse with indignation. In that environment, Schiff's restraint risks looking detached, even elitist, while Vance's anger looks relatable, even heroic. The system does not just tolerate this contrast, it feeds on it. Schiff hinted at this dynamic with a kind of dry cynicism that bordered on humor. He noted that outrage now travels faster than policy and sticks longer than facts. If anger were a renewable energy source, he joked, Washington could power itself indefinitely without passing another bill. The line drew a smile, but it also landed as an indictment. Because jokes only work when they reveal something true. The more Schiff spoke, the clearer his underlying fear became. He was not trying to shame Vance, and he was not trying to police emotion. He was trying to slow the moment down long enough for people to see the slope they were standing on. Politics, he implied, rarely collapses in a single dramatic moment. It erodes through habits, incentives, and repeated exceptions that quietly become rules. At the same time, Schiff could not fully escape the charge that his position sounded abstract to people living inside the abuse cycle. For those who believe online mobs operate without consequence, calls for restraint feel one-sided. Why should leaders absorb attacks when attackers face no cost? Schiff acknowledged that imbalance, but refused to let it dictate behavior at the top. Leadership, he argued implicitly, is not about matching the lowest common denominator. This tension produced one of the most divisive questions of the entire episode. Is it fair to demand composure from those with power while offering no protection for their families? Or does abandoning composure simply guarantee that everyone becomes fair game? The question does not have a clean answer, and that is precisely why it resonated. Observers also began to notice how quickly the focus drifted away from the original attacks. The people who targeted Vance's wife faded into the background, while the response consumed the spotlight. Schiff warned that this, too, was part of the pattern. Outrage redirects attention, often away from its supposed cause. The cycle rewards reaction more than accountability. There was a subtle layer of satire in Schiff's commentary that rarely gets credit. He suggested that if American politics continues down this path, press briefings may eventually be replaced by group therapy sessions. Senators could air grievances, representatives could process feelings, and the State of the Union could come with a trigger warning. The humor was light, but the critique was sharp. Behind the jokes sat a serious claim. When emotional release becomes indistinguishable from governance, institutions lose their shape. Rules become optional, norms become nostalgic, and every conflict is framed as uniquely justified. Schiff was not arguing that leaders should be emotionless. He was arguing that emotion without discipline eventually devours the structure meant to contain it. By this point, the audience was no longer being asked to pick a side in a single dispute. They were being asked to reflect on what kind of political culture they are rewarding, one that treats anger as honesty and restraint as weakness, or one that insists power must look different from impulse, even when impulse feels earned. Part 3, then, is where the story stops being about two men and starts being about everyone watching them. The controversy survives because it mirrors a larger anxiety about politics itself, whether the system still values limits or whether limits now look like luxuries of a past era, and whether, in demanding leaders who react like humans, the public is prepared to live with the consequences of leaders who no longer act like institutions. By the final phase, the argument had shed any remaining pretense of being about a single remark or a single man. It had become a mirror held up to the audience itself, reflecting not just political instincts, but cultural appetites. The question was no longer whether the response was justified, but why so many people seemed to need it to be. Anger was no longer simply expressed. It was consumed, shared, defended, and demanded again. At this point, even those uncomfortable with the escalation began to acknowledge an inconvenient reality. Calm leadership rarely satisfies a public conditioned to constant stimulation. A measured response feels incomplete, almost evasive, when compared to the emotional clarity of outrage. In that sense, restraint is not merely a virtue under pressure. It is a gamble. It risks being ignored in favor of something louder, sharper, and easier to digest. This is where the debate turned inward and slightly uncomfortable. If leaders respond with restraint and are dismissed as weak, who exactly is responsible for the incentives that reward the opposite? Politicians do not perform in a vacuum. They perform for an audience that clicks, shares, and amplifies. The outrage economy does not just exist because politicians feed it. It exists because voters, viewers, and commentators keep it profitable. The humor in this realization is dark but unavoidable. American politics often pretends to be shocked by its own behavior, as if the system keeps surprising itself. Each escalation is treated as an anomaly, even as anomalies become routine. At some point, surprise stops being honest. It becomes a form of denial with better lighting. In this environment, calls for decorum can sound almost rebellious. Asking leaders to slow down, to choose words carefully, to resist the urge to strike back, feels countercultural. It goes against the grain of a media ecosystem that rewards immediacy over reflection. Restraint does not trend well, and it rarely fits into a clip shorter than 30 seconds. The controversy also exposed a quiet contradiction in public expectations. Voters often say they want leaders who are relatable, who react like ordinary people. At the same time, they demand stability, predictability, and control from those same leaders. The two desires collide under pressure. When that collision happens, disappointment is inevitable, no matter which path is chosen. There is an uncomfortable honesty in admitting that many people enjoyed the moment, not because it was noble, but because it was cathartic. Watching a powerful figure break script can feel like justice, even when it solves nothing. The satisfaction is real, but it is fleeting, and it leaves behind a higher baseline for the next reaction. This is the trap that concerned institutionalists keep pointing to. Each justified exception lowers the threshold for the next one. Each emotionally satisfying response raises the expectation for escalation. Over time, the extraordinary becomes ordinary, and the ordinary becomes inadequate. Politics does not explode all at once. It acclimates. The final questions raised by this episode are not easily resolved, and perhaps that is the point. Should leaders be expected to absorb abuse that would be unacceptable in any other profession? Should families be protected by norms that no longer carry enforcement? And if those norms are already broken, is restoring them even possible without collective buy-in? There is also a quieter, more unsettling question hovering beneath the surface. What happens when every political disagreement is framed as existential, personal, and unforgivable? If every slight demands a response, and every response demands escalation, where does compromise survive? At what point does politics stop being a system for managing conflict and become a theater for rehearsing it? In the end, this episode did not settle anything. It clarified positions, hardened instincts, and exposed fractures that were already there. One side walked away feeling seen, the other feeling alarmed. Both sides felt justified, and neither felt persuaded. That alone tells you something important about the moment we are living in. The real legacy of this controversy may not be the words that were said, but the reactions they provoked. They revealed how comfortable the country has become with emotional brinkmanship, and how uneasy it is with restraint. Whether that trajectory continues is not a decision any single politician can make. It is a collective choice, reinforced one reaction at a time. If American politics has indeed crossed a line, it did not do so quietly. It crossed it in public, with cameras rolling and audiences cheering or wincing in equal measure. The question now is not whether the line existed, but whether anyone still feels compelled to stand behind it. What remains to be explored, and what this moment quietly demands, is a deeper look at how normalization actually works. Political cultures rarely announce that they are changing. They drift. They adapt. They rationalize. Each controversial moment is defended as unique, unavoidable, or provoked, until uniqueness itself loses meaning. By the time anyone agrees a boundary has moved, the ground beneath it has already shifted. In that sense, the dispute between Vance and Schiff is less a confrontation than a case study. It reveals how quickly outrage can be reframed as necessity, and how easily necessity can be used to excuse behavior that once triggered alarm. Nobody wakes up intending to dismantle norms. They wake up convinced that this time is different. That conviction is how erosion hides in plain sight. There is also a generational undercurrent running through the reaction. Younger political audiences, raised on unfiltered feeds and constant commentary, often interpret restraint as artificial. They are fluent in irony, impatience, and skepticism toward polished language. To them, a raw response can feel honest in a way scripted statements never do. Older audiences, shaped by different expectations, read the same moment as a warning sign. Neither reaction is irrational. They simply operate on different assumptions about what politics is supposed to do. The media's role in this divide cannot be ignored. News organizations claim neutrality, but algorithms do not. The content that spreads is not necessarily the content that informs, but the content that activates. Anger activates. Conflict activates. Calm explanations tend to sink quietly beneath the surface. In that environment, even leaders who value restraint are pressured to perform emotion, if only to remain visible. This pressure creates a feedback loop that is difficult to escape. Politicians respond sharply because sharp responses are rewarded. Audiences reward sharp responses because they feel seen and validated. Commentators then frame those responses as evidence of cultural decline or renewal, depending on their priors. The loop spins faster each time, leaving little room for pause. Humor has become one of the few tools capable of interrupting that cycle. But even humor carries risk. A joke can diffuse tension, or it can trivialize harm. Schiff's dry wit worked precisely because it aimed upward at the system, rather than downward at individuals. But not every figure has the temperament or credibility to pull that off. In less careful hands, humor becomes another accelerant. Another layer of this controversy lies in what was not said. The silence from many political figures was not accidental. Silence can signal caution, calculation, or quiet agreement. In moments like this, saying nothing is often safer than saying something nuanced that pleases no one. That silence, however, also shapes the narrative. It leaves the loudest voices to define the terms of debate. Over time, repeated episodes like this reshape public expectations. Voters begin to anticipate escalation and feel underwhelmed by anything less. A calm response no longer reassures, it disappoints. The absence of anger can even be interpreted as indifference. Leaders who resist that expectation must accept that they will sometimes look out of step with the moment. This raises a final, deeply uncomfortable question. Are Americans asking too much of their leaders emotionally and too little institutionally? The demand for relatability has blurred into a demand for constant emotional performance. At the same time, faith in institutions has eroded to the point where rules feel optional rather than binding. The combination is volatile. If leaders are expected to feel everything their supporters feel and express it publicly, the distinction between representation and embodiment collapses. Politics becomes less about channeling interests through systems and more about reenacting emotional states on a national stage. That shift may feel satisfying in the short term, but it carries long-term consequences that are rarely acknowledged. The irony is that many of the people cheering the loudest for confrontational authenticity also express fatigue with chaos and division. They want someone to fight, but they also want someone to fix things. Those desires coexist uneasily. Fighting generates attention. Fixing requires patience. The skills do not always overlap. Looking back at this episode years from now, it may not be remembered for the exact words spoken or the personalities involved. It may be remembered as one of many moments when the country was offered a choice between escalation and restraint, and could not agree on which one still counted as strength. Those moments accumulate. They leave traces. None of this means anger has no place in politics. Anger has driven reform, exposed injustice, and broken complacency. But anger without boundaries is not reformist. It is corrosive. It consumes attention without building solutions. Schiff's warning, stripped of personalities and partisanship, was fundamentally about that distinction. Vance's reaction, likewise stripped of symbolism, was about refusing to accept a cost that politics too often demands in silence. That refusal resonated because it touched something real. The tragedy, if there is one, is that both impulses can be valid while still being incompatible. As the cycle continues, the burden of judgment shifts increasingly to the audience. Viewers decide what to reward, what to amplify, and what to ignore. Each click is a small vote for the kind of politics that feels most compelling. Over time, those votes add up to something resembling consent. The uncomfortable truth is that political culture is not imposed from above alone. It is negotiated daily through habits, expectations, and reactions. Leaders test boundaries, but audiences decide whether those tests succeed. That shared responsibility is easy to forget when blame feels more satisfying. In the end, this story is less about outrage than about appetite. What kind of political nourishment does the public seek? Substance that takes time to digest, or emotional bursts that offer immediate release? The answer may vary, but the consequences of that preference are already visible. If restraint is to survive as a value, it will not be because it is dramatic or popular. It will survive only if enough people decide that not every provocation deserves a performance. That decision cannot be outsourced to leaders alone. It belongs to the entire system that rewards them. Until then, moments like this will continue to surface, framed as crises, debated as symbols, and absorbed into a larger pattern. Each one will feel urgent. Each one will promise to be the breaking point. And each one will quietly test whether American politics still recognizes the difference between reaction and responsibility. What is striking, the longer this episode lingers, is how familiar it already feels. A moment erupts, reactions polarize, principles are invoked, and then the country moves on slightly altered. No formal vote is taken on these shifts. There is no announcement that the rules have changed. The change is absorbed quietly, like background noise that becomes noticeable only when it stops. In that way, controversies like this operate less as scandals and more as calibration points. They test how much heat the system can tolerate, how far language can stretch, and how quickly outrage cools. Each test provides data, not just to politicians, but to strategists, media producers, and platforms deciding what to elevate next. The lesson is rarely written down, but it is learned all the same. One reason the debate persists is that it refuses to stay neatly partisan. People who normally agree on little else find themselves divided internally. Some feel instinctive sympathy for a leader who refuses to stay silent when family is targeted. Others feel an equally strong unease about the erosion of restraint at the highest levels of power. Both reactions coexist within the same political camps, sometimes within the same individual. That internal conflict is revealing. It suggests that the issue touches something deeper than ideology. It touches expectations about adulthood, authority, and control. In everyday life, people are taught that maturity involves choosing when not to react. In politics, however, maturity is often measured by visibility and force. The two standards collide in moments like this. There is also a psychological comfort in framing politics as a series of confrontations. Conflict provides narrative clarity. It creates protagonists and antagonists, heroes and villains. Restraint complicates the story. It introduces ambiguity, delay, and uncertainty. Those qualities are harder to package, harder to sell, and harder to sit with. This helps explain why even criticism of escalation often adopts dramatic language. Warnings about norms are framed as existential threats. Appeals to calm are delivered urgently. The system struggles to talk about moderation without turning it into another form of intensity. Even restraint, it seems, must now be loud to be heard. The long-term risk is not that politics becomes emotional. It always has been. The risk is that emotion becomes unmoored from proportion. When every incident is treated as unprecedented, the word loses meaning. When every response is framed as necessary, necessity becomes a blanket justification. Over time, judgment erodes not because people stop caring, but because they care about too much, too often, all at once. In this environment, leaders face a narrowing set of choices. They can escalate and be rewarded in the short term, or they can restrain themselves and risk being dismissed. Neither option is comfortable. The temptation to choose visibility over virtue grows stronger with each cycle. That temptation does not require bad intentions. It thrives on fatigue. Fatigue is perhaps the most underappreciated force in modern politics. Audiences are exhausted. Leaders are exhausted. Institutions are exhausted. Under those conditions, sharp reactions feel energizing, even when they deepen the problem. They provide the illusion of momentum. Calm responses, by contrast, can feel like asking tired people to be patient again. Yet patience is precisely what institutions are designed to enforce when emotions run high. They exist to slow decisions, to impose process, to prevent impulse from becoming irreversible action. When leaders bypass that function rhetorically, even temporarily, they weaken the habit of deferring to structure. Habits, once lost, are difficult to restore. Another subtle consequence of repeated escalation is cynicism. When outrage becomes routine, sincerity is harder to detect. Audiences begin to wonder whether anger is genuine or strategic, whether restraint is principled or calculated. Trust erodes not because people believe nothing, but because they believe everything is performative. That cynicism feeds back into the system. Leaders sense skepticism and respond by amplifying emotion further, hoping to cut through doubt. The cycle tightens. Each turn makes moderation less credible and extremity more normalized. The episode that began with one remark thus ends up illuminating a much larger pattern. Politics increasingly operates on emotional volume rather than deliberative weight. Loud moments dominate, while quiet work struggles for attention. The imbalance shapes not just discourse, but governance itself. None of this guarantees collapse. Political systems are resilient precisely because they absorb stress. But resilience should not be confused with health. A system can endure while still becoming less effective, less trusted, and less capable of resolving conflict. Endurance alone is a low bar for democracy. The unresolved tension at the heart of this controversy remains. How does a political culture protect families without encouraging escalation? How does it allow leaders to be human without abandoning the discipline that power requires? There are no simple formulas for these questions, only trade-offs that must be acknowledged honestly. What is clear is that pretending the problem will solve itself is no longer plausible. Each new controversy adds another layer of expectation, another adjustment to what feels normal. Over time, those adjustments redefine the baseline. What once shocked becomes familiar. What once seemed extreme becomes merely sharp. The responsibility for that shift does not rest with any single figure. It is distributed across institutions, media, and audiences. Everyone participates, even passively. Choosing not to reward certain behaviors is as consequential as choosing to amplify others. Silence and attention both have effects. As this chapter closes, it leaves behind no resolution, only a clearer view of the terrain. The debate between reaction and restraint is not going away. It will reappear in new forms, with new names and new triggers. Each time, the same questions will resurface, perhaps with less urgency, perhaps with more. Whether those questions eventually lead to recalibration or further escalation depends less on rhetoric than on habit. Habits form slowly, through repetition and reinforcement. They can be changed, but only deliberately. In that sense, the most important outcome of this episode may not be what anyone said about it, but what people do the next time something similar happens. Do they pause, or do they pile on? Do they reward clarity, or do they reward volume? Do they expect leaders to absorb pressure, or to release it publicly. Those choices, repeated often enough, will determine the shape of political life more than any single controversy ever could. And that, more than outrage or defense, is the quiet legacy this moment leaves behind. What often goes unspoken in debates like this is how quickly moral certainty becomes addictive. Once a moment is framed as righteous anger, stepping away from it can feel like betrayal. People begin to defend not just the action, but the emotional state behind it. Anger becomes something to be preserved rather than questioned. In that atmosphere, even suggesting moderation can sound like siding with cruelty. This is where the conversation quietly narrows. Nuance becomes suspect. Ambivalence is treated as weakness. The public discourse rewards decisiveness, even when decisiveness means oversimplifying complex situations. The space between empathy and restraint shrinks until it is barely visible. Political actors are acutely aware of this shift, even when they deny it publicly. They know which reactions will travel and which will stall. They understand that emotional clarity often matters more than factual completeness. That knowledge shapes behavior, sometimes unconsciously. Over time, leaders begin to speak not only to express belief, but to satisfy expectation. Expectation, once set, is difficult to reverse. Audiences acclimate quickly to heightened emotion. What once felt shocking soon feels ordinary. What once felt bold begins to feel insufficient. Each escalation resets the baseline. That process rarely announces itself, but its effects accumulate relentlessly. There is also a subtle moral trade-off embedded in these moments. When anger is framed as justified, it inherits a kind of immunity from critique. Questioning it feels inappropriate, even cruel. Yet without critique, anger becomes self-validating. It no longer needs to explain itself. It only needs to be louder than what came before. This is one reason institutional voices sound increasingly out of place. They speak in a register that assumes patience still exists. They rely on shared assumptions about process, consequence, and continuity. When those assumptions erode, the language built on them starts to feel archaic. Not wrong, but mismatched to the moment. The discomfort many felt watching this episode unfold was not just about tone. It was about recognition. People recognized patterns they had seen before, in different contexts, escalating in familiar ways. The details changed, but the rhythm stayed the same. Outrage surged, lines hardened, and reflection arrived late, if at all. One cannot fully understand this dynamic without acknowledging how personalized politics has become. Political disagreement is no longer framed solely around ideas or outcomes. It is framed around identity, dignity, and belonging. When those elements enter the picture, disputes feel existential rather than procedural. That emotional framing makes restraint feel unnatural. At the same time, personalization blurs accountability. When everything is personal, everything feels justified. Every response becomes a defense of self rather than a choice with broader implications. That shift makes it harder to ask whether a reaction serves the system as a whole. This tension sits at the heart of the controversy. Defending one's family is a deeply human instinct. Expecting public officials to suppress that instinct entirely feels unreasonable. Yet allowing that instinct to dictate public behavior at the highest levels carries risks that cannot be ignored. Both truths exist simultaneously, and neither cancels the other out. What made this episode resonate so strongly is that it forced those competing truths into direct confrontation. It did not allow audiences to retreat into easy categories. It demanded a choice between emotional alignment and institutional continuity. That choice is uncomfortable precisely because it exposes conflicting values many people hold at the same time. There is also a performative aspect to outrage that deserves scrutiny. Public expressions of anger often signal virtue as much as they signal pain. They tell audiences what to applaud, what to condemn, and where to stand. In that sense, outrage is not just an emotion. It is a directive. When leaders issue that directive, intentionally or not, they shape behavior beyond their immediate circle. Others take cues, adopt tones, and mimic strategies. Over time, those cues redefine what political engagement looks like. The shift is gradual, but it is cumulative. Institutional restraint, by contrast, does not issue clear directives. It asks for patience without promising satisfaction. It emphasizes long-term stability over short-term catharsis. In an environment driven by immediacy, that ask can feel abstract, even naive. And yet, restraint has always functioned as a kind of social technology. It exists not because people lack emotion, but because emotion, left unchecked, tends to escalate conflict rather than resolve it. Institutions were designed to absorb shock, not amplify it. When they fail to do so, the consequences ripple outward. The difficulty lies in communicating that value without sounding detached. Appeals to restraint often fail not because they are wrong, but because they are poorly translated into a language audience recognize. They speak of future costs to people living in the present moment. They warn of erosion to people craving clarity. This communication gap is one reason debates like this feel unresolved. Each side speaks past the other, grounded in different priorities. One emphasizes immediacy and authenticity. The other emphasizes continuity and consequence. Both claim to protect democratic values. Both fear losing something essential. The public response reflects that divide. Some viewers felt relief seeing a leader push back forcefully. Others felt anxiety watching another norm bend under pressure. Many felt both reactions at once. That ambivalence rarely trends, but it is widespread. As the conversation stretched on, it became clear that no single statement would settle the matter. The debate was not about right and wrong in isolation. It was about what kind of political culture people were willing to endorse through repetition. Culture, after all, is not declared. It is rehearsed. Each viral moment becomes a rehearsal. Each reaction becomes a cue. Over time, those cues shape expectations so thoroughly that alternatives feel foreign. Restraint becomes an anomaly. Escalation becomes routine. This is why the most consequential aspect of this episode may not be its immediate fallout. It is the lesson it quietly teaches about what works. Politicians learn. Media learns. Audiences learn. The learning is not always conscious, but it is effective. If there is a warning embedded here, it is not about any individual failing. It is about momentum. Systems rarely collapse because of one decision. They drift because enough decisions move in the same direction. Momentum builds quietly, then suddenly. Whether that momentum continues depends on choices that seem small in isolation. A click, a share, a pause before reacting, a willingness to tolerate ambiguity. These actions feel insignificant, but multiplied across millions of people, they define the environment leaders operate in. The uncomfortable reality is that political culture is co-produced. Leaders shape it, but they do not control it alone. Audiences reward behavior, media amplifies it, and institutions adapt to survive within it. Responsibility is distributed, even when blame is not. As this chapter closes, it leaves behind a lingering unease rather than a verdict. The unease comes from recognizing how fragile the balance has become, how quickly justified anger can slide into normalized escalation, how easily restraint can be reframed as weakness. None of this suggests that silence is the answer, or that emotion has no place in public life. It suggests that expression carries weight, and that weight increases with power. Navigating that reality requires more than instinct. It requires judgment, exercised under pressure. In the end, the controversy offers no clean resolution, because it reflects a broader uncertainty about what leadership is supposed to look like now. Is it meant to mirror public feeling, or to temper it? Is it meant to react, or to absorb? Is it meant to satisfy, or to stabilize? Those questions will resurface again, attached to different names and different moments. Each time, the same tension will reappear. Each time, the outcome will depend less on principle than on habit. Habits form slowly, through repetition. They harden quietly, through reward. Changing them requires intention, not outrage. Whether there is still room for that intention remains an open question. What is certain is that moments like this do not simply pass. They accumulate. They teach. They linger, and long after the specific words are forgotten, the patterns they reinforce continue to shape the political landscape in ways that are difficult to reverse.